gathering. My name is Beck Allen and it's a pleasure to be your MC today. I'm the Acting Director of Public Diplomacy Programs at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Canberra, aka DFAT. I am beaming in from my home on Ngunnawal land, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples with us today. As we gather digitally, I want to take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place, and in doing so, recognise the various traditional lands where each of us live, work and share our stories. The APAM gathering at Darwin Festival is taking place both online and in real life on the traditional lands of the Larrakia people. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and my visual description is of a fair-skinned woman with strawberry blonde hair piled up on top of her head. I am wearing a black top with black earrings and black glasses, and I am standing in front of a white brick wall. This event is being live streamed on Swapcard, APAM's online event platform. We're joined live by APAM gathering participants from around Australia and across the world. It will also be recorded and uploaded to Swapcard to watch on demand. The conversation will run around an hour and include a Q&A towards the end. So please make sure to put your questions under the question tab in the live discussion box on the Swapcard platform during and after Saul's presentation. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the artists, arts workers, administrators, technicians, presenters and advocates tuning in from across Australia and around the world. Gathering together has never been more important, and we sincerely thank you for joining us. On behalf of APAM, it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Saul Eslake. Saul is an independent economist, speaker and company director. He has worked as an economist in Australian financial markets for more than 25 years, including stints as the chief economist at McIntosh Securities, ANZ and Bank of America Merrill Lynch. He's been the director of the Productivity Growth Program at the Grattan Institute, and he is currently a member of the Australian Parliamentary Budget Office's Advisory Panel and the Australian Tax Office's Tax Gap Advisory Panel, both of which are more exciting than they sound. In 2015, Saul started his own economics consultancy business operating out of Hobart, and in 2016 became Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Tasmania. But it's not all numbers and data. Saul has taken on leadership roles in the arts, including as chair of the Tasmanian Arts Advisory Board, board member of the Australian Business Arts Foundation, and chair of 10 Days on the Island. Saul is beaming in from Muanina land, and we acknowledge the Palawa people of Lutruwita. Saul's visual description is of a fair-skinned man with grey hair, round-rimmed glasses, and he is wearing a black suit jacket with a blue button-up shirt. And behind him is a landscape depicting the locations of Primangana and Marawa. It seems apt that we are having this conversation in the week of the national census. We're going to take a deep dive into data and our place nationally and internationally. You all are a sector that naturally turns its gaze outwards, across oceans and lands, communities and cultures. Saul is going to take us from the macro to the micro and back again. Ladies and gentlemen, Saul Eslake.
Thank you very much, Pam, for that, Beck, for that introduction. It was very kind of you. And can I begin, as you did, by acknowledging the Muanina people as the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm speaking, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging of the Palawa people of Lutruwita or Tasmania. Behind me, you can see Primangana, which is one of the most important sites to the Tarkaina people of the far northwest of Tasmania, taken from the village of Merrill, where my parents lived for 25 years of their life, and it's a special place to them, but it's a special place to me as well. Most Tasmanians will profess a particular attachment to the state in which they live, even if, like many Tasmanians, they spend a good deal of their time outside it. You in the performing arts world, scattered around Australia, and those of you who are overseas, hello to you as well, and thank you for being here. You know, of course, that the performing arts and the visual arts are part of the way in which Australians tell our stories to each other. but they're also an important part of the way we tell our stories and present our nation and the cultures of our people to the rest of the world. And they're also, of course, part of the way in which we in Australia, a very remote part of the world, get to experience and understand parts of the culture and the stories of people from all different parts of the world, whether those people are represented in our multicultural community or may have very little contact with people in this remote part of the world. So in some ways it's fitting that I've been asked by the organisers of this event to talk about the economics of international mobility. And in order to do that, I'm, like most economists, going to show a lot of slides, and in so doing, I hope that means that you can see the slides that I'm putting on the screen. Let me perhaps warn in advance that I'm going to show quite a lot of slides, and I will go through some of them quite quickly, but the slides will be available to all of you after the event. I think they might be being distributed, but otherwise they will be on APAM's website or on my website, the address of which you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, I hope, of the screen there. So let me begin by talking about international mobility. And being an economist, I'm going to highlight, first of all, just how important increased mobility in various ways has been 50 years. If we look in the first instance at goods and services, international trade, exports or imports of goods and commercial services have been one of the most dynamic areas of the world economy between the mid-1970s, when international trade first began to open up, through to the early 2000s, when what came to be known as globalization reached its peak. The share of exports in global economic activity more than doubled, from about 15% to a little over 30%. After globalization peaked in the early 2000s, and particularly in the aftermath of the global financial crisis in 2007-8, globalization has retreated a bit, and exports are not quite as big a share of economic activity as they had been in the early 2000s, but they're still much more important than they were in the second half of the 20th century. And in much the same way, capital has flowed more freely between nations during the last 25 or so years than it had done for most of the 20th century. And while sometimes international capital flows have been destabilizing, they've also been a very important way in which new technologies have been transferred to what we call developing or emerging economies, and trade linkages have been built between poor and rich nations. Of course, it's not just goods and services and capital that have been moving more freely across international borders in the last 40 or 50 years. There have been both permanent and temporary movements of people much more freely than had been the case since time immemorial, really. Immigration from, in most cases, low-income countries to high-income countries has increased enormously between the early 1960s to a peak in 2010, although in response to what many Western countries have felt were higher levels of, in particular, refugee intakes than they could comfortably accommodate, immigration has retreated a bit over the last 10 years, and in some countries, most obviously the United Kingdom, and to a lesser extent the United States, there's been a political reaction that has seen the election of governments that have been less accommodative to large movements of immigrants than had been the case in days gone by. Also notable, of course, has been the enormous growth in international tourism over the last 60 or so years, from barely more than 2% of the world world's population travelling across international borders 60 years ago to almost 20% of the world's population travelling from one country to another in 2019, before, of course, the closure of most countries' international borders with the onset of COVID in March of last year. While, like any major change, there have been costs and benefits from this greater movement of goods and services, capital and labour, people, temporarily and permanently across international borders. Overall, it has been associated with an improvement in global living standards. As these charts show, the biggest gains have gone to people in what we would call middle-income countries. That's, in particular, countries like Korea, Taiwan, China, more than most, some countries in Latin America. Low-income countries, particularly in Africa, have seen very little benefit. High-income countries have also done fairly well out of this process. In China in particular, but in a number of other countries as well, the proportion of the population living in extreme poverty, which the World Bank defines as less than $1.90 a day in 2011 prices, has fallen very significantly, although in India and in most of sub-Saharan Africa, there are still very substantial proportions, in many cases more than half the population living in extreme poverty. And if we adopt less austere definitions of poverty than $1.90 a day, say, for example, $5 a day, which I find hard to imagine living on, even in countries like China, there are still very significant people who've gained far less from the various forms of globalization that I've mentioned here than people in other countries have been able to do. Another way of looking at the impact of globalization is what economists have come to know as the elephant chart, because of the shape that is traced out here. What this chart shows is the change in real incomes by each 100th of the global income distribution over the 20 years to 2008. That is probably over the period in which globalization was at its most intense. It's not talking about income distribution within individual countries, which is the way we normally think about it, but rather income distribution across the world as a whole. And what this chart shows is that the greatest gains in income over this 20-year period accrued to the middle class in emerging economies, in particular China. That is, people between about the 35th and the 65th percentiles of the income distribution. They did very well. And so too, of course, did the top 1% of the world's population ranked by income, who almost entirely live in rich countries like the United States, Europe, Japan, and Australia and New Zealand. The people who did worst were those in the poorest countries in the world, in the bottom 10% of the income distribution. That's most of the population of sub-Saharan Africa and much of the population of India. And people in the lower part of the income distribution in rich countries, like the United States, Europe, and to some extent Australia, some of whom saw almost no increase in their real incomes at all. And charts like this do explain some of the important political developments across the globe in the last 25 years. They help to explain, for example, why the authoritarian regime in China is, despite being very authoritarian and increasingly so, nonetheless pretty popular as far as one can tell with the overwhelming majority of the Chinese people. It also helps to explain the resentment that's felt by many of those who see themselves as having been left behind by economic and political developments in so-called advanced economies over the last 30 years, and hence have become increasingly attracted to populist movements of either the left or the right that have seen the election of people like Donald Trump in the United States, or Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom, or the appeal that Jeremy Corbyn had to voters in parts of the United Kingdom before, or in the rise of people like Viktor Orban in Hungary and the PIS government in Poland, and the appeal of the far right, the National Front, in places like France. But I think changes in the distribution of global income like this are, I think, an important part of understanding some of the important political trends that have been going on around the world. And while I've been talking here about global trends, much the same has also been true of Australia. The proportion of Australia's economy that comes from exports of goods and services has risen from less than 14% 50, 60 years ago to almost 25% of our national income in the most recent 3 or 4 years. And likewise, investment flows both into and out of Australia, both direct investment, that is through multinational companies, and portfolio investment, especially through Australian superannuation funds, have become much more important relative to Australia's economy than they had been before the early 1990s. And of course, we've also seen important changes in movements of people. Australia, more than most other advanced economies, has, since European settlement began in 1788, been a nation of migrants. With the possible exception of Israel, Australia has a higher proportion of its population who are either born overseas or who have at least one parent born overseas than almost any other nation on earth. And after a pause in the 1970s and 80s, when we were dealing with high unemployment, immigration has again been a significant driver of Australia's population growth over the last 20 years. And while it's contested territory, my view is that even if you allow for some of the downsides of high immigration rates, such as pressure on house prices and housing affordability and traffic congestion, but when you also allow for some of the other benefits that our migrants have brought us that are hard to measure in concepts like gross domestic product, immigration has made a positive contribution to the well-being of those who live in Australia, as well as, of course, those who choose to make this country their home. What we've also seen over the last 40 years is a very significant increase in temporary movements of people visiting Australia from other countries. That's risen from barely more than 5% of our population 40 years ago to, at the peak, almost 35% of our population. And of course, many Australians have taken advantage of the opportunity to visit other countries, whether it's been to visit relatives or to explore new places. And all sorts of trends, including in particular the decline in the cost of international travel, have been contributors to that. But that has also come to at least a temporary end with the onset of COVID in March of last year. As has been the case internationally, the greater freedom of the movement of goods and services, capital and people across Australia's borders has contributed to an improvement in average living standards of Australians. During the period when which we were a relatively closed economy and society, which really traces back to Federation and the First World War until the early 1990s, Australia, though we were more prosperous than many parts of the world, nonetheless saw our standard of living as measured by per capita income relative to that of the United States, still the world's richest economy, decline from almost 90% to, by the early 1990s, 75% of US standards of living. We slipped from having one of the highest per capita incomes in the world at the time of Federation to, by the early 1990s, ranking only 26th by that metric. But since we have begun to open up, through to at least 2015, Australia's living standards improved significantly relative to those in the world's richest economy, the United States, to the point where by about 2014-15, our per capita income was only about 10% less than the US average. Now, of course, greater freedom of movement of goods and services, capital and people wasn't the only factor in that. The resources boom, for example, made a significant contribution to the improvement in our material living standards as well. And some of that has, of course, faded over the last 5 years, and there have been other flaws emerge in our economy and our model of economic growth that are reflected in the decline in our relative living standards over the past 3 or 4 years. But we're still significantly better off, notwithstanding that recent poor performance in the last 5 years, than we had been in the late 1980s or early 1990s. As in other countries, it's fair to note that the benefits of economic and social changes haven't been equally distributed over the past 20 years. It's interesting when you look at the available information, it tells us that the distribution of income, though it's by no means equal, hasn't become significantly more unequal over the last 20 or so years. Yes, the top 20% have a much bigger share of income than anyone else, but that share hasn't increased all that much since about 2005, though it did increase a bit over the previous 10 years. Where there's been a more striking increase in inequality has been in the distribution of wealth, where the shares accruing to the wealthiest 20% of Australia's population has increased quite significantly over the last 15 years, which is as much as we have consistent data. And that in particular reflects the extraordinary increase in house prices that has occurred in this country over that period of time, and the declining rates of home ownership, with an increasing proportion of property ownership concentrated in the wealthier groups within our society and those who've not been able to gain their first foot on the property ownership ladder, missing out on what has been an important wealth escalator in this country, as it has been in many others. There's a different way of looking at that, though, and that is, if we look at it by age, there's been a significant increase in inequality in the distribution of income, and especially wealth, as between the old and the young. People aged over 65 in particular have seen their share of national wealth increase from about a quarter 15 years ago to a third in 2018. That's an enormous increase of about 8 percentage points in the space of just 15 years. And of course, the big losers as a result of the increasing concentration of wealth in older age groups have been people under the age of 45, which of course would include a lot of Australia's performing artists. That increase in income inequality in favour of older age groups isn't simply because of the ageing of the population, which has meant, of course, that a greater share of Australia's population has been in groups aged, for example, between 55 and 64 or 65 and over. If you look at the average income and the average wealth of those groups, you can see that they have also increased more significantly than they have for the rest of the population. And I think that points out some flaws in the way that Australia taxes income and wealth, respectively. In particular, that our tax system, unlike that of some other countries, barely touches wealth at all, even though it can be quite severe on incomes unless they're earned through capital gains or dividends or rent. But wage and salary income and small business income is relatively highly taxed, whereas in this country wealth isn't really all that taxed at all, which is, I think, one of the major reasons for the sort of patterns that I've been talking about here. Let me turn to some reflections on how Australia's economy has fared since the onset of COVID. In many respects, our experience, though it's been quite tough, hasn't been as severe as has been experienced in many other comparable countries. So as measured, for example, by real gross domestic product, or GDP, our recession was shallower and our recovery was stronger than that of most of the countries we normally compare ourselves with. Australia and New Zealand were, until the June quarter of this year, the only advanced economies, apart from Korea and Taiwan, where the level of economic activity as measured by real GDP had returned to its pre-pandemic levels. We're the only economies where the level of employment is higher than it was before the onset of the pandemic. As a result, although Australia in particular saw quite a steep rise in unemployment in the early days of the pandemic, not as big as the United States, but bigger than most other so-called advanced economies, we're now just about the only one where the unemployment rate is lower than it was when the pandemic first hit in March last year. Having said that, it's important to acknowledge that the impact of the pandemic was far from even across different sectors of the economy, and the subsequent recovery has likewise been far from uniform. So there are still a significant number of sectors, including the arts and recreation sector, where the level of output is lower than it was on the eve of the pandemic. And likewise, there are many sectors, of which the arts and recreation sector is one, where fewer people are working than was the case before the onset of the pandemic just on 15 months ago. In particular, it's worth noting that younger people have borne the brunt of the job losses during the early stages of the pandemic and have had greater difficulty regaining jobs than people aged 35 or older. And likewise, it's notable that people in relatively low-paid industries who experienced the greatest share of job losses during the recession that the pandemic wrought have also had the greatest difficulty getting back into work during the ensuing recovery. Australia's done a better job economically than most other countries for, in simple terms, two reasons. First, we've done a better job than most other countries in suppressing the virus, and that's still true despite the difficulties that are now being experienced, particularly in New South Wales, but also in other parts of Australia. And at a time when the pandemic first broke, when we didn't know what the virus was capable of doing to people's health, and we didn't know how long it would take to develop and produce an effective and safe vaccine, suppressing the virus was really the only available strategy for minimising the damage to people and to livelihoods. There was never really a trade-off between lives and livelihood, as the experience of countries like Sweden that eschewed lockdowns have demonstrated. Sweden has had more fatalities and death and infections relative to its population than other countries that chose tougher lockdowns, but it hasn't done any better either when it comes to economic developments. Australia and New Zealand, of course, were far more able to suppress the virus because of geography, because we are a long way away from almost anywhere else in the world, and we don't share land borders with our neighbours. It's been much easier to keep the virus out than it is for countries in Europe, for example, or Canada and the United States, or in Asia, which do share land borders with their neighbours, or if they are, like the United Kingdom or, say, the Philippines, are islands, are nonetheless separated from their neighbours by much smaller stretches of water than Australia and New Zealand are from any of our neighbours. The other thing that has helped Australia's economic performance is that Australian governments have done more by way of providing support to households and businesses through what economists call fiscal policy through their budget than almost any other countries in the world. The United States did more, but that didn't help them all that much because they were so incompetent in their management of the virus in its first year that spending a lot more money didn't really give them better economic outcomes. But since the turn of the year, there has been another strategy available to countries with far fewer economic costs than doing what you have to do to suppress the virus. And that is, of course, vaccinating as much of your population as quickly as you possibly can. And unfortunately, Australia chose not to pursue that strategy. And I say chose not to pursue that strategy because we are where we are with regard to vaccinations as a result of choices that our governments made. If you look at this chart here, you'll see in particular a contrast between Australia and Canada, which I always like to compare with Australia because in terms of the way it ticks, its parliamentary tradition, its banking system, its media system, the way it works, Canada's more like Australia than any other country on the planet. And you can see that although they had a slow start relative to the United Kingdom or the United States as we did, Canada's now in a position where more than 70% of its population has had one jab and more than almost 60% of its population have had two jabs. Whereas here in Australia, we're just over 30% having had one jab and about 15% of our population having had two. That was, as I say, the result of deliberate choices that our government made to put all of their eggs in the AstraZeneca basket, which they did partly because it was cheaper and partly out of what I call their obsession with what the government likes to call sovereignty, that is the notion that it was somehow better because it could be made in Australia. Canada couldn't make Pfizer or Moderna either, but that wasn't important to them. Their priority was to get as many jabs into as many arms as quickly as they possibly can, and Pfizer was the best way of doing it. Yes, deliveries of the AZ vaccine were slower than expected, and Europe's decision to block initial deliveries of up to 3 million doses to Australia was a particularly unfriendly gesture. It didn't help that local production of the AstraZeneca vaccine was slower to ramp up than had been originally expected, but it was probably also the case that our initial success in suppressing the virus bred complacency on the part of the population. It didn't help that both the government's medical advisors and the government itself mishandled the communication around the risks associated with the AstraZeneca vaccine. But all of that played into an unusually high level of vaccine hesitancy in this country. Surveys show that a higher proportion of Australians are unwilling or uncertain about getting a vaccine than any of 13 other advanced economies. And the government has been curiously unwilling to confront that. This is a government that's been willing to spend millions of taxpayers' dollars on any number of advertising campaigns on other issues, but hasn't been willing to confront the anti-vaxxers and others, or to reassure the population who have genuine uncertainties about some of the risks associated with the vaccine, for reasons that I find very hard to understand. So we now find ourselves in Australia in a position where, although for most of the last year, we've lived under less onerous restrictions than any number of other developed and developing economies. Now we're living under more onerous restrictions than most other so-called advanced economies, and it looks like it's going to remain that way until a sufficiently high proportion of our population can be vaccinated. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But let me highlight another way in which mobility sheds light on what's happening in economies. Apple and Google, who know far more about what we do, when we do it, and where we do it, than sometimes makes me feel comfortable, have nonetheless made the information which they collect about what we do, when and how often, and published it in ways that allow us to get a sense in real time, before official statistics are published, of what's happening. The Apple indicator, for example, summarizes how people are moving in their cars by using public transport or by walking, and you can see how that's ebbed and flowed with the initial imposition of restrictions across the whole of Australia when the pandemic first hit, the lockdown in Victoria during the third quarter of last year, and more recently the impact of restrictions that have been posed initially in Sydney and then in 3 or 4 other states, and now today the ACT as well. And the Google indicators likewise show how people have been visiting workplaces, shopping centres, parks and other recreation places. That's all in the blue line, or alternatively being forced to stay in their homes. And that also gives you a sense of how restrictions are impacting economic activity. And what's particularly striking is the comparisons those indicators now highlight between us here in Australia and countries like the United Kingdom or Canada, which have been far more effective in vaccinating their populations quickly than we have been, even though they are, of course, also dealing with much higher numbers of cases on an ongoing basis than we are. What the experience of countries like the UK and Canada and Israel shows is that the vaccine doesn't stop people getting or transmitting the Delta variant, but it certainly substantially reduces the seriousness of it for them and the probability of them going to hospital, let alone losing their lives if they manage to catch the virus. And that in turn means that those countries are able to open up more than we are. Some other countries, in particular France and Italy, have been more willing to to have things like vaccine passports that have allowed those who are prepared to get vaccinated to go about their lives in a more normal fashion, something, again, our government doesn't seem willing to confront anti-vaccine sentiment in the Australian community in the way that other governments have been willing to do. And so those mobility indicators, again, indicate the extent to which, in particular, New South Wales and from time to time Victoria, which is now in its 6th lockdown, have had their economic lives and other aspects of their lives affected by restrictions that governments have deemed necessary to keep the virus at bay, which they have to do because of the slow progress of vaccines. The Grattan Institute, for which at one stage, as Beck mentioned earlier, I worked, has released some modelling in the past couple of weeks that attempts to answer the question, when could the Australian economy be allowed to open up? And based on epidemiological advice that you can't do that safely until you've reached what epidemiologists call herd immunity, that's usually associated with at least 80% of the population being vaccinated. Depending on what you assume about how contagious the Delta variant is, that is something that's unlikely to be reached until at December this year at the earliest. And if we're not prepared to give vaccines to children during that period, that is kids aged between 2 and 12, then it could be March next year until a sufficient proportion of our total population have been vaccinated to allow us to open our international borders. And in mentioning our borders, it's worth noting that the measures which the Australian government have imposed over movements across our international borders have been more restrictive than those imposed by any other democratically governed country in the world. No other government of a democracy in the world has seen fit to ban its citizens from leaving. And it's never been obvious to me how stopping Australians from leaving has helped to contain the spread of the virus. What it does do, of course, is allow the government to get away with doing less by way of providing adequate quarantine facilities than otherwise. Likewise, no other democracy of which I'm aware has banned its citizens from returning to the country, let alone threaten them with jail if they seek to return from a country where they had a good chance of dying from COVID, as some Australians actually did in India. And I suspect the reason for that is that Australia is one of the very few countries, democratic countries in the world, that doesn't have in its constitution or in treaties which it has ratified provisions which prevent governments from doing the sort of things that the Australian government has done. Indeed, so unusual is the stringency of Australia's restrictions on movements of people across our international borders that the people who compile the now widely used index of the stringency of COVID-related restrictions don't include those two measures, that is, bans on citizens arriving or leaving, in their measure of the stringency of restrictions, because it never occurred to them that governments would actually do that sort of thing to their own people. Nonetheless, it is apparent that these travel bans have been highly popular with voters who approve of keeping our borders closed by almost 3 to 1, according to available opinion polls. Now, everyone knows, of course, that the closure of our borders to inbound arrivals has imposed a heavy burden on our tourist industry and on our universities. What's less realised, of course, is that it's provided an indirect form of economic stimulus by, in effect, requiring Australians to spend the more than $50 billion that they would have spent overseas if they'd been allowed to go overseas, instead in various ways in the domestic market, in their homes, on, for example, electronic and electrical goods, outside their homes, on improving their gardens and the like. When the stores have been open, on clothing, footwear, and pharmaceuticals and toiletries. It wouldn't be Australia, I guess, if in times of stress we weren't spending more on booze, and we have been. And we've been spending a lot more on new motor vehicles and renovations. And as I say, the amounts involved here exceed $50 billion. That is the biggest stimulus that's been provided to the Australian economy through the COVID period, with the exception of JobKeeper. that cost almost $90 billion. The other thing that the closure of our borders is doing, which gets less attention than perhaps it deserves, is that it is resulting in faster reductions in the unemployment rate than would otherwise have been the case. That's because with the borders closed, the population isn't growing nearly as fast as it was over the decade pre-COVID, when, for example, the working age population grew at an average of 26,000 a month, which meant that Australia needed to create at least 16,500 new jobs a month in order that the unemployment rate fell. In fact, over the decade prior to the onset of COVID, 16,500 new jobs a month was, on average, exactly what we did create. And that's why over the course of that decade, although the unemployment rate fluctuated from month to month and quarter to quarter, it basically ended where it started at 5.25%. But since the onset of COVID, with the closure of our borders, the number of new jobs we have to create in order to have the unemployment rate fall is a lot less ambitious than it used to be. Over the last 6 months, the population's grown at an average rate of less than 10,000 a month, but we've created 48,000 new jobs a month. That's about 8 times as much as we needed to keep the unemployment rate constant. And so the unemployment rate has fallen to 4.9%. If it continued to grow at the rate it has done over the past 6 months, by June next year, when the borders are meant to reopen, the unemployment rate would be down to 1.2%. Almost certainly, and particularly with the lockdowns we're now seeing in Sydney and other parts of the country, we won't be creating nearly that many jobs in the near term. But even if we created half as many as we have done, the unemployment rate would be 3.25% by June next year. If we did a quarter as much over the next 12 months as we have over the past 6, which I think is quite achievable, then the unemployment rate would by June next year be down to the sort of territory, 4.5%, that the Reserve Bank and the Treasury now say is consistent with reasonably full employment. And that means that it may not be that long after then that interest rates start to rise. One other type of mobility that's worth noting as well is that with the onset of COVID, we've seen a significant reversal in the traditional flow of people out of regional areas into the cities. There's been a very substantial increase in the number of Australians who have been wanting to, as it were, escape to the country, or as we now say in Australia, to the regions. That's particularly a Melbourne phenomenon. The number of people seeking to leave Melbourne has been significantly greater in the last 12 months than it ever has been before. That may be a reaction to Victoria's particularly long lockdown, or perhaps to the over-the-top way in which the Victorian government policed that lockdown, something which doesn't seem to have been emulated by other states. But we've also seen a slowing in the number of people moving, for example, to Brisbane. We've seen a pickup in the number of people moving to Adelaide. We've seen some recovery in people moving to Perth after the end of the mining boom. But overwhelmingly, there's been a pickup in people moving to regional New South Wales, regional Victoria, and to a lesser extent, regional Tasmania and South Australia, which may also have interesting consequences for the performing arts and perhaps for audiences in both the big capital cities on the one hand, and for the need to get more out into regional areas so that people can experience the performing arts in ways that in many cases hasn't been as possible in regional areas as it has been in our major capital cities. Let me finish just with some observations about more directly on the performing arts sector. Unfortunately, in Australia, we don't have anything like the richness of economic data that you have, for example, in the United States. And the US data shows that the performing arts sector, and particularly here defined as live entertainment excluding sports, has been devastated by the onset of the pandemic. Looking at spending on live entertainment excluding sports, you can see that that fell almost to zero with the onset of the pandemic. And even now, as of June of this year, the level of personal spending on the performing arts is still about 90% below where it had been before the onset of the pandemic, whereas total personal spending in the United States is back above pre-pandemic levels. That in turn has had a very serious impact on the employment of people in the performing arts sector, which at one stage had fallen by about 60% from its pre-pandemic peak. It has begun to recover somewhat, but still, as of June, the number of people in performing arts companies who still have jobs is about 40% less or below its pre-pandemic peak, and the number of independent artists who are working is about 18% below its pre-pandemic peak in the United States. Here in Australia, as far as one can tell, employment in the creative and performing arts, that slide should say in blue, would appear to have recovered to close to pre-pandemic levels. That probably reflects the impact of JobKeeper on large and smaller performing arts companies. I suspect individual artists haven't been doing as well, but there's no data on that in the Australian context that allows us to make that judgment. Although it may be the case that the number of performing artists who still have jobs is closer to its pre-pandemic peak than is the case in the United States, what's also evident is that those who have got their jobs back in the performing arts sector aren't working as many hours as they had been pre-pandemic. The proportion of people in the performing arts who are classified as part-time is now about 56%. That's about 10 percentage points more than it was before the onset of the pandemic. That's about as much as the available data allows me to say about the impact of COVID-19 on the performing arts, or at least employment in Australia. But nonetheless, I think the pandemic has raised some other issues that the performing arts sector will be affected by over what could be an extended period. The first of those relates to what I've spent most of the last half hour or so talking about, Australia's international borders. The government's working assumption is that the borders will remain closed until June next year. That is, until after the election, which has to be held no later than the 21st of May. And given that the closure of Australia's borders appears to be popular with voters, the government's not going to be in any hurry to accelerate that, I would think. Whether they do open sooner or later on a selective basis depends more than anything else on progress with vaccinations. I find it a bit distasteful that some people, some occupations and some industries appear to have found it easier than others to get exemptions from border controls. And obviously, if you're a sports person, you don't have any trouble getting into or out of the country, even though you have to quarantine when you get back. If you're a Kardashian or some other kind of high-profile celebrity or a billionaire, you seem to be able to get into the country reasonably easily. If you're a cabinet minister, you can get in and out of the country reasonably easily. You can go and look up relatives and branches of your family tree in Cornwall, and you don't have to spend a fortnight in a 3-star hotel on your way back if you're a certain kind of cabinet minister. But the performing arts sector doesn't seem to have been as fortunate in getting exemptions from restrictions on border movements as other parts of the community have been. And it would appear, I suspect, that the maintenance of strict quarantine requirements, even after some of the tighter caps on arrivals that were imposed a month ago are lifted or abolished, as we've been told they will be by the end of this year, are likely to act as a deterrent to international travel to and from Australia. Of course, it's not only what we do that matters too, it's also what other countries do with regard to international borders. And there have been some suggestions that some countries may not confer the same status on AstraZeneca vaccines as they do on mRNA vaccines that could inhibit Australians' ability to travel to other countries, given that we've decided to be much more reliant on AstraZeneca than some other countries that made different choices have been. Even when the borders do open, as I hope they eventually will, the cost and availability of international travel won't go back immediately, if at all, to what it was before the onset of the pandemic. The capacity on international civil aviation routes into and out of Australia will almost certainly take some time to return to pre-COVID levels, just as was the case after September the 11th, 2001. International travel is likely to be much more unpleasant as a result of the ongoing bureaucratic restrictions that are likely to be imposed in the aftermath of COVID, and it will probably be more expensive because governments will seek to recover the cost of all the hoops through which They make people jump when they travel overseas onto passengers rather than absorbing it into national government budgets. And both of those things are likely to make it both more difficult and more expensive to stage international tours or to bring overseas performers to Australia. Vaccination protocols are another issue that the performing arts, like other sectors of our economy and community, are going to have to grapple. I would think that vaccination passports of the sort that are now widely accepted in countries like France and Italy will offer a path to an earlier opening of performance venues than would be the case if we refuse to contemplate things like that. But just as the government's been unable to confront the anti-vaccination sentiment that is stronger amongst its own supporters than it is in the broader community, the government likewise appears unwilling to go down the path of requiring or facilitating vaccination passports. That's despite the fact that this government has been more than willing to make lots of other things compulsory or to restrict people's rights and liberties for other reasons. I mean, think about the number of things for which you now have to have a police check or a working with children card in order to perform certain occupations, or the number of things for which you require a license in order, for example, to do electrical or plumbing work in people's homes, or for that matter, to undertake various types of medical procedures, or to administer or to prescribe drugs, or to dispense financial advice. Why is it that the government isn't willing to say that in order to do certain things, you need to have a vaccination, or that in order to perform certain jobs, you need to be vaccinated? Why isn't the government even willing to give legal backing to those employers who want to make being vaccinated a condition of employment? Well, I think the only answer to that must be their unwillingness to confront certain prejudices that are disproportionately evidenced within their own ranks. And then finally, of course, the COVID-safe regulations and requirements, the limits on space occupancy, the contact tracing requirements, the ventilation rules that have all become, to some extent at least, necessary in the aftermath of COVID and which will be with us for a long time afterwards, are going to add to venue operating costs and fees, which presumably you're going to have to reflect in what you charge to your patrons. So COVID has raised an enormous number of issues for communities and societies as a whole, some of which have economic consequences, but there have been particular consequences for the performing arts industry that in many ways have been more severe than those for other parts of the economy. I hope this presentation has shed some light on some of those things that will be helpful to you as you seek to navigate the difficult times we're experiencing at the moment and the challenging future that you undoubtedly have over the next couple of years. And with that, Beck, I will hand the forum back to you, and hopefully there are some questions.
Thank you, Saul. There definitely is, and there is a lot in your presentation to discuss. There's chatter and questions happening on the Swapcard platform, so I'll flick between two screens. We'll try and address as many of the questions as possible. I think you've really broken down with amazing evidence just what international mobility means in this moment and for the immediate future. A community that is inherently mobile, where any limits on mobility really impact the work being made, the stories that are being told, and the audiences that the sector's looking to speak with and connect with. There was an artist who pitched a work this morning, and she used the turn of phrase, the privilege of movement, and shout out to Mish Gregor and the APHIDS team for that. And it really made me look at your presentation with different eyes, and the disruption of COVID and globalisation and the movement of people, goods and services has perhaps been a privilege, and looking at this opportunity to reassess how we move back into a new space. I'm going to go with a trio of questions around employment, market recovery and public appetite to begin with. So grab a drink of water if you need, Saul, for a moment.
Yeah, that's fine.
Your slides on employment figures showed that during the first 4 months of the pandemic, the art and recreation industry was the most impacted in terms of major decreases in employment. And I need to acknowledge that that is, of course, history is repeating itself in this moment as so many of our major cities are in lockdown again. I wanted to throw in another data point, which has been collected via the I Lost My Gig platform. which is an initiative of the Australian Festival Association and the Australian Music Industry Network, which as of 5 August showed that close to $85.5 million had been lost in income, impacting close to 30,000 employees. What does employment recovery look like for the creative industry once borders reopen and there is a return to full movement? How long do you think the sector will take to bounce back into pre-pandemic employment levels? Alongside that is the flip side, which is consumer confidence and the public's appetite to attend performing arts. COVID has really made the public uncertain financially, and in terms of being in large groups, lockdowns, all the things you just talked about. When do you anticipate we might see consumer confidence returning and the public's appetite to be in those places and spaces return? So there's the economic return, but there's perhaps also the social return as well.
Yeah, good questions. The honest answer that I can give to the question of how long it will take to get back to normal is I don't think I know. In particular, because if normal means being able to do things within Australia, then that's probably something that we can contemplate starting to do by Easter next year. Assuming that we can get at least 80% of our population, including children, vaccinated by around Easter next year, we should be able to do things within the country fairly normally again. But it will be sometime after that before we can do all the things that we used to do, which includes, going overseas and bringing people back, bringing people to this country for artistic and all sorts of other purposes. And in particular, almost certainly the Chinese will never come back in the way that they had been before because of the deterioration in the bilateral relationship that is not going to be solved with the end, or at least with the getting on top of COVID in a lasting way. Now, that may not have been quite as important to the performing arts as it has been, for example, to the university sector or to the tourism sector, but nonetheless, Chinese artists have been part of what has been on offer, and going to China has been an important opportunity for Australian performing artists as well. And that's not coming back in the foreseeable future, I would think. And of course, it's a very complex area that you probably know more about than I do, Beck, anyway, the bilateral relationship with China. So I don't think I'll say too much more about that. In terms of consumer confidence, let me make a couple of observations. First, it did seem to me that during that period earlier this year when performing arts venues did reopen, and, at one stage we were able to say Sydney was the only place in the world where Hamilton was being presented, or Come From Away was being presented. And although they didn't really do it in Melbourne and other places, it seemed as though venues were going to open up again, that there was an enormous appetite for it. I was in Sydney a couple of times and happened to be going past the theatre where Hamilton was being shown, and there were enormous queues there for that. And there was something else I remember walking past at the Gretel Packer Theatre, I think it's called, or the Ros Packer Theatre in Sydney, and there was something else that was on there that was attracting an enormous crowd. And so there's undoubtedly an appetite for that. There are, a large part of the Australian community has been starved of the opportunity to see shows and performances, and I think when they are able to do that in a way that they feel safe, which again probably will depend on getting at least 80% of us vaccinated, I think there will be what economists call pent-up demand for performing arts experiences, in the same way that there's been pent-up demand for all sorts of other things that show when lockdowns come to an end. And the other thing I'd note about this is that consumers in general do have the capacity to spend that money, because although we've been through the most serious recession that Australia's had since the 1930s, unlike most other recessions, governments have taken an awful lot of the consequences of that for people onto their balance sheets. So because so much money has been thrown at households through JobKeeper and through the as it then was, not now, elevated level of job seeker payments to people who've lost their jobs, the support that's been provided to smaller businesses, the support that is currently going to people who've been adversely affected by lockdowns that the federal and state governments are funding, even though JobKeeper hasn't been reinstated. It's sort of been reinstated under different names. Households have socked away an additional $135 billion in bank deposits since February last year. This is money that they have available to spend, and which I think will help to cushion the efforts that governments will no doubt be making to sort of put their budgets back on a path to smaller deficits and presumably eventually at some point in the distant future surpluses. So households do have a lot of money to spend. I think there will be, as that experience earlier this year showed, latent pent-up demand for performing arts experiences. There might even be more than normal because people may still be shy about travelling overseas. They may still either not be able to, or they might not want to, or it might be too expensive to travel overseas. So there might actually be even more money that people are willing to spend on other experiences, of which the performing arts is an important one. So if we can get to, it's at least 80% of our population being vaccinated, and if we can get away from this, kind of what my friends overseas, my colleagues overseas, just think is amazing the way that we lock down in response to numbers that of cases that they would be delighted to have. If the chief medical officer of the United Kingdom were able to stand up one morning and say we had 300 cases, they'd be popping champagne, not locking down. If they were able to say we had one case, that wouldn't be an excuse for a national capital to lock down in the way that it apparently is in Australia. But, we just appear to have zero tolerance for this sort of thing, and we worked ourselves, whether consciously or unconsciously, into a position where we react to case numbers in a way that almost no other country, apart from New Zealand, almost no other country in the world does. And so at some point we need to move away from that as well. But we probably won't be able to do it until our politicians are willing to, until our leaders are willing to be a bit less risk averse than they currently are.
Well, the sector stands ready to respond to that pent-up demand the moment that it is possible. One more question on employment, which is it's slightly outside of the sector. Saul, isn't the 5% unemployment rate an artificial construct of full employment? And if it is possible for Australia to reach a lower level of unemployment, wouldn't that be a good thing that could happen without the need for increasing interest rates, particularly when there still hasn't been sufficient wage growth for the last decade? And that is a broad question, but also very applicable to the sector.
And the answer is, my answer is unequivocally yes. It's, I think, quite evident that Australia, like other countries, can operate with lower levels of unemployment than had previously been thought feasible before inflation begins to take off. I mean, even in the United States, it took almost 2 years of the unemployment rate being less than 4 before wages growth began to move, and even when it did move. And this might be one of the few things for which the Trump administration can legitimately claim, I'm not sure credit, but at least that it happened on their watch, that wages growth at the bottom end of the wage distribution actually began to accelerate for the first time in more than 20 years. Because the unemployment rate got down to less than 4% for longer than it had done for any period since the late 1960s. And the fact that, we had in Australia almost a decade where the unemployment rate was fluctuating around 5 to 5.5%. And in New South Wales, it actually got below 5% for a couple of years without any upward pressure on wages at all, I think is very compelling evidence that we can and should do better than we had been doing. The encouraging news is that the Reserve Bank and even the current government get that. The Reserve Bank is now saying quite openly that they won't start raising interest rates until wages and prices have actually started to accelerate, rather than doing what they've done in the past, which is raising interest rates as soon as their staff tell them that wages and prices are going to start to accelerate. And most of those forecasts have been wrong. They think that point at which wages and prices might start to accelerate is an unemployment rate of less than 4.5%. But they don't know what it is and they admit it. It's almost as if you can excuse me saying it, it sort of reminds me of a famous law case in the US in the 1960s, which was about obscene material. And the Supreme Court judge in that case said, you can't define pornography, but you know what it is when you see it. And in the same way, the Reserve Bank and others are, I think, to their credit, honestly admitting that they don't know what full employment is, but they'll know it when they see it, and they'll wait until they see it before they do anything about it. And more broadly, I think changes in the way the labour market works, the fact that more employers these days, if for some reason they need less labour, they have other options than sacking 5% of their workforce in order to get their wages bill down. They can reduce everyone's hours by 5%, or they can, you make less use of casual and part-time labour than they had. So, the whole meaning of unemployment is a bit different from what it used to be. There's more attention being paid to underemployment, people who have jobs but aren't working as many hours or earning nearly as much as they would like to and are capable of earning. And, I absolutely think that it's the intention of the Reserve Bank to chase a much lower unemployment rate than they have done before, and that they will get there.
Thank you, Saul. You have told a really compelling story via data. And we've got a couple of questions on the value of data and measurement and evaluation. Particularly, if we can't be measured, can we be seen? And the sector has been encouraged, particularly over the past decade, of looking at the sector's value through an economic lens, so the economic impact of the cultural and creative industries. Do you think perhaps that there has been too much focus on measuring our value in that way, and that the return on investment of time spent doing that has perhaps done us a disservice? A similar question, as an industry, we have never been able to successfully articulate the value of the arts to our government. I'm curious to hear from you as an economist, what should we be doing different to change this?
It'll probably surprise some people to hear me answer that question by saying that not everything should be valued in terms of what you can put a dollar on. And, economists are often accused of being, in someone's words, desiccated calculating machines that know the value, that know the price of everything and the value of nothing, to use another cliche. I have to say to you, in all honesty, it isn't true. That no less a famous economist than Maynard Keynes, wrote about these sorts of things during the time he spent as chairman of the British version of the Australia Council, which he founded. The Council for the Encouragement of the Arts, I think it was called. And he wondered out loud why it is that people have so much difficulty attaching the sort of value to works of art that they will quite readily do to a piece of machinery or a block of land. And, people in the arts and elsewhere do put themselves through extraordinary hoops in order to put dollar values on things that are inherently unquantifiable. And, that creates employment for some microeconomists, which is a different branch of the profession from what I do. It creates employment and work for a whole lot of consulting firms who attempt to put dollar values on these things and then put them into submissions to government departments in the hope of, getting bigger grants out of them next time, or getting a more sympathetic hearing more generally. But you can do that up to a point. But I think in the end of the day, you also ought not to lose sight of the fact that, part of the value of the arts is things that you can't put a dollar value on. And there's probably something to be said for trying to push that argument harder, rather than just accepting someone else's dictum that the only things that are valuable are the things that can be measured.
I think I can hear people across the country and around the world cheering you on that comment, Saul. Sticking with data for just another moment, a very practical question. Saul, really interested to know who you engage for your data visualization and perhaps the process you go through You've told your story through numbers. Many people on the call tell their stories through a lot of different mediums. But if you could just talk to us a bit about using numbers as a narrative.
Well, I mean, I create my own charts. I always have done. It's just use PowerPoint. It's a cliche that a picture tells 1,000 words. But I've always, because I've worked for organisations that employ economists not so much to write reports but to communicate with their customers. In the case of banks, you'd be communicating with personal customers, business customers, investor customers, people overseas, and with a broader community as a whole through the media. And I've often thought of myself as telling stories, not in the same way that artists do, but nonetheless sometimes with the same intentions. That, Paul Keating used to talk about the importance of a narrative, his word, in selling economic policies. And so, I try and put things in charts that tell a story about some aspect of economic performance, or what financial markets are doing, or what governments are trying to do, or some of the challenges and difficulties they might face in seeking to attain the objectives they've set for themselves. My business partner Rati Lahura, who's sitting in on this, often gives me advice, because she's a practicing artist, on things that work and things that don't. And I'm very grateful for the insights that she helps me. But basically, I sort of do this stuff myself. And even when I had a staff, when I was chief economist of ANZ, I still used to do most of my own charts, because I'm just anal about fonts and colours and, headings and those sorts of things. And I couldn't really force junior staff to, tie themselves in knots to get things exactly the way I wanted. I just did it myself. And now that I'm on my own, I still do. It's a habit that doesn't die.
Thank you, Saul. We are hitting up against time, but I just want to let you know that there's been a poll running in the background around vaccination. And if those that responded were representative of Australia, which one would hope they are, we have hit the 80% threshold. We look forward to your prediction of Easter 2022 being a return to the new normal, and in particular, valuing the arts, valuing the things you can't put a dollar value on. So thank you very much for your presentation. It's a lot of food for thought, for frustration and for action. APAM thanks and acknowledges the Australia Council for the Arts, Creative Victoria and Arts NT. Now stay tuned on the Swap Card platform for the next session starting soon. The profile, here's how we work. Thank you, take care and keep safe.